The polished conference room at Benson and Weller law firm smelled faintly of lemon polish and stale coffee. Morning sunlight struggled through the frosted windows, casting a gray pall over the long oak table where the Lane family had gathered. Margaret Lane, 62, sat rigid in a straight-backed leather chair near the head of the table. A strand of her silver hair slipped from the neat chignon she'd secured before dawn, when she woke with a pit in her stomach in the sense that this day would be worse than all the others. She tugged the strand behind her ear and folded her hands in her lap, willing them not to shake. Muhammad married Douglas Lane, her husband of 40 years, cleared his throat. He was still a handsome man in his mid-60s, though the grief etched in the lines around his mouth looked as practiced as the solemn expression he wore. He placed a hand over hers. She didn't squeeze back. Across from them, their children, Rachel, 35, composed in a navy blazer, and Caleb, 32, tapping his knee under the table, exchanged a glance that hovered somewhere between impatience and dread. At the far end, Elliot Price, the family's trusted attorney, sorted a stack of documents with the air of someone who knew exactly how the morning would go. Margaret had known Elliot since he was a junior associate. Back then, she'd liked his measured tone, the way he deferred to Edith's opinions, the way he assured everyone the law would protect what was rightfully theirs. Today, she felt a dull ache of apprehension she couldn't quite explain. Elliot looked up, his gaze pausing on Margaret before sliding to Douglas. For just an instant, so quick she thought she might have imagined it, there was something like caution in his eyes. "Thank you all for coming," Elliot began, his smooth voice carrying across the silent table. "As you know, we are here to finalize the last will and testament of Edith Lane, your mother, grandmother, and to many of us, a respected friend." Margaret's throat tightened. Edith had been her fiercest supporter, a woman who'd stood by her when Margaret married Douglas, despite the whispers that she wasn't good enough. Elliot's voice droned on about codicils and probate filings, but Margaret barely heard. She was remembering the last conversation she'd had with Edith. The old woman had looked so frail in that hospital bed. Her once powerful voice reduced to a whisper. "Look closely, Maggie. Some things aren't what they seem," Edith had murmured, pressing her liver-spotted hand over Margaret's. "Promise me." Margaret had nodded, though she didn't know what Edith meant. Now sitting here under the fluorescent lights, she wondered if she was about to find out. Elliot began distributing printed copies of the will. His fingers lingered a fraction of a second longer on Douglas's copy. Douglas didn't meet her eyes when she looked over. Rachel glanced at her father with a frown, as if she too felt something was off. "I'll proceed through the main provisions first," Elliot said. "Then there are private addendums to be addressed individually." "Private addendums?" Caleb asked, brow furrowed. "Yes," Elliot said, flipping through the documents. Edith was thorough. Some matters required discretion. Margaret thought she saw the edge of a cream-colored envelope sticking out of the folder nearest Elliot's hand. It had her name on it, she was sure of it. A shiver moved over her skin. Douglas shifted beside her. "Can we just get through this quickly?" His voice was tight. Elliot offered a bland smile. "Of course, I'll be as concise as possible." The entire table stilled, listening as he began to read. The words blurred into a monotonous roll: specific bequests, household contents, charitable donations. Margaret stared straight ahead, fighting the sense that she was sitting on the edge of a precipice, seconds away from a fall she hadn't prepared for. Then Elliot's tone changed. He picked up the cream envelope and held it delicately, like something that might explode. "There is one final instruction to be addressed. Should Mrs. Margaret Lane be present?" Everyone turned toward her. Margaret's heart thudded once painfully against her ribs. She lifted her chin and met Elliot's gaze. And for the first time since she'd walked into the room, she thought she saw something flicker there. Something that looked remarkably like fear. The conference room dissolved into a low hum of shifting papers and polite murmurs as Elliot tucked the cream envelope back into his folder. "We'll take a brief recess before concluding," he announced, rising smoothly. "Please help yourselves to coffee in the lounge." Margaret stayed seated, trying to steady her breathing. Douglas stood too quickly, nearly knocking his chair over. Without a word, he crossed the room and followed Elliot through the frosted glass door that led to the adjoining private office. The door clicked shut behind them. Rachel was immediately at her mother's side. Mom, what is going on? Margaret shook her head, unable to form an answer. Her pulse was hammering so hard she could barely think. Caleb came over as well, his expression clouded. Dad's been weird about this whole thing. He was up half the night, pacing. Did he say anything to you? No, Margaret whispered. Nothing. But she remembered all the late nights Douglas claimed he was working with Elliot on tax issues. The sudden trips to the city, the way he'd flinched when she asked if everything was all right. Look closely, Edith's voice echoed in her mind. She rose shakily. I'll just step out for a moment. Rachel frowned. Do you want me to come? No. Margaret forced a small, reassuring smile. It's fine. Just give me a minute. She slipped out into the hallway, pulling the door softly closed behind her. The corridor was quiet, except for the low murmur of voices from the private office. The glass pane was frosted, but as Margaret stepped closer, she realized she could see the vague outlines of the two men inside. Douglas was pacing. She recognized his shape, the restless way he moved when he was anxious. Elliot sat behind the desk, elbows planted on the polished wood, his hands steepled under his chin. She edged closer until she could make out fragments of their conversation through the thin partition. Can't just bury it, Douglas hissed. Keep your voice down, Elliot snapped, his tone clipped. They'll find out. You heard the instruction. If she insists, she won't, Elliot said firmly. She's never challenged you before. Edith knew, Douglas muttered. She knew everything. Silence. Then Elliot sighed. And she's dead now. You need to calm down. I'll handle Margaret. Margaret felt her stomach roll. She pressed her palm to the wall for balance. Handle me? She whispered to herself. Douglas's voice dropped to a hoarse whisper, but she caught the final words as though they were shouted. If she ever sees the transfers, it's over. Margaret's vision went watery. She swayed, grabbing the edge of a framed certificate on the wall to steady herself. Transfers? Something heavy and nauseating settled in her chest. She took a slow, ragged breath, trying to quiet the panic spiraling up her throat. Before she could move away, the door rattled. Elliot was coming out. Margaret turned quickly, pretending to study a framed photograph on the opposite wall, a black and white portrait of the firm's founding partners. The door swung open. Elliot stepped into the hallway. Douglas followed, his face drawn and pale. Elliot's voice was smooth again, almost casual. Mrs. Lane, are you all right? She turned slowly, keeping her expression neutral. Yes, just needed a moment. Douglas's gaze skittered away from hers. We're almost done here, he said gruffly. Let's get this over with. Margaret said nothing. She walked past them into the conference room, her heart thumping with a sick certainty. Rachel looked up as she re-entered. Mom? I'm fine, Margaret murmured, taking her seat. But she wasn't fine. She was beginning to understand that whatever she'd suspected, it was only the beginning. Margaret could feel her pulse in her throat as Elliot returned to his place at the head of the table. He smoothed the edges of the cream envelope as if it were a delicate artifact. Thank you for your patience, he said, his voice carefully measured. We will now proceed to the final provision. Rachel shifted in her chair, shooting her father a look of wary suspicion. Caleb folded his arms across his chest, jaw tight. Margaret kept her gaze fixed on Elliot, unwilling to look at Douglas. If she looked at him, she wasn't sure she'd be able to keep from screaming. Elliot cleared his throat. This is a sealed addendum, authored by Edith Lane approximately 6 months before her passing. It contains instructions regarding any concealed or undisclosed transfers of property or funds related to the estate. Douglas's voice came out strangled. Elliot! Elliot raised a hand, never taking his eyes off the page. I am obligated to read this in full, Doug. Margaret felt a cold, grim satisfaction at the flicker of panic that crossed her husband's face. Elliot unfolded the document with deliberate slowness. The silence in the room was so complete, Margaret could hear the faint ticking of the clock over the doorway. In the event my daughter-in-law, Margaret Lane, is present, Elliot read, I instruct my attorney, Mr. Elliot Price, to disclose any and all transactions, transfers, or encumbrances which may diminish her lawful share of my estate. Caleb leaned forward. What does that mean? What transactions? Elliot swallowed visibly. Mrs. Lane, Edith was concerned that properties she intended to pass to you might be diverted elsewhere. She required that a record be kept. Douglas put his face in his hands. Oh, God. Margaret's voice was steady and cold. Read it. Elliot looked up, meeting her eyes. For a flicker of a second, she thought he might refuse. But then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. He picked up another sheet of paper. Approximately 4 months prior to Mrs. Lane's death, the title to her property at Hollow Creek, valued at approximately $850,000, was transferred to a holding company, Arrowhead Partners, LLC. Rachel blinked. I've never heard of that company. Elliot continued, his voice flattening. Arrowhead Partners is owned by Douglas, Lane, and Elliot Price. The words hit the table like a thunderclap. Caleb shot to his feet. You did what? Douglas lifted his head, face ashen. It was a tax shelter. This is being blown out of proportion. Margaret spoke over him, her tone soft but lethal. You stole from your mother. Douglas shook his head frantically. No, Maggie, listen to me. It was never about that. Edith understood. Edith understood so well, Margaret said, that she made certain I would find out. Her hands were perfectly still on the table, but inside she felt something breaking loose, some dam she'd been shoring up for decades. Elliot's gaze darted between Douglas and the shocked faces of Rachel and Caleb. Mrs. Lane, Edith also left specific instructions regarding the sale of that property. She intended for the proceeds to fund a trust in your name. Caleb rounded on his father. How could you do this? Douglas's voice rose, brittle and desperate. I did this for all of us, to protect the estate. Margaret almost laughed. Protect it or steal it? The words were out before she realized she'd spoken them, but once she heard them echo in the heavy silence, she didn't want to take them back. Elliot drew in a careful breath. There is one additional note, he said, picking up the last page. Edith directed that any evidence of concealed transactions be disclosed to her designated outside counsel in the event of a dispute. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Who is the designated counsel? Elliot hesitated. Miriam Grant. She recognized the name. Miriam was Edith's old friend and a respected estate attorney. The fact Edith had planned this far ahead made Margaret's stomach turn. She knew. She looked across the table at Douglas. You have been lying to me for years, haven't you? Douglas opened his mouth, but no words came out. Rachel's voice was a hoarse whisper. Dad, did you and Elliot? Margaret shook her head slowly, cutting her off. Don't ask, not yet. She turned to Elliot. I want copies of every document, every deed, every signature. Elliot's face was bloodless. Of course. For the first time since she had entered the building, Margaret felt an emotion that wasn't sorrow or dread. It was purpose. Margaret felt the weight of the room pressing in on her. For a moment, she feared her legs would give out. But she forced herself upright, gathering the scattered pieces of her composure as though they were shards of porcelain she refused to let anyone see broken. I'll need a few minutes, she said, her voice startlingly calm. Elliot looked relieved for the smallest fraction of a second before he schooled his expression into concern. Of course. Take your time. Rachel and Caleb watched her with wide, searching eyes. Mom, Rachel began, her voice tremulous. Margaret held up her hand. Please, just give me a moment. Without waiting for an answer, she turned and walked out of the conference room. She didn't go far. The hallway felt too exposed, too full of echoes. Instead, she slipped into a small side office she'd noticed earlier, a tidy space lined with legal textbooks in a single mahogany desk. She shut the door behind her and pressed her back to it, breathing hard. Her eyes fell to the phone in her hand. She opened her contacts with trembling fingers. Patricia, her old friend from the county clerk's office, had retired, but Margaret knew she still had access to public records. If there were other transactions, other hidden transfers, Patricia would be able to confirm it. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to steady the sudden rush of nausea. How long? How long had Douglas been planning this? How long had Elliot been complicit? How many late nights and whispered phone calls had she explained away as work? Her thumb hovered over Patricia's name, then pressed call. It rang twice. Margaret? Patricia sounded surprised. Is everything okay? No, Margaret whispered. I need your help. A beat of silence. Tell me what you need. Margaret swallowed, pressing her hand to her forehead. There's a company, Arrowhead Partners, LLC. I need to know every property transfer involving that name. Every deed, every filing, and I need it today. All right, Patricia said without hesitation. Give me 15 minutes. Thank you. Margaret's voice cracked on the last word. When she ended the call, she sank into the desk chair, gripping the edge as the weight of it all finally crashed down. It wasn't only the theft. It wasn't just the betrayal of her trust or the violation of Edith's wishes. It was the realization that she had been living inside a fiction, one Douglas and Elliot had written together, chapter by chapter, while she played the dutiful wife, too distracted by grief and loyalty to look closer. She thought of the nights Douglas returned home late, reeking of whiskey and excuses, the business trips that never added up, the unguarded glances Elliot cast across the dinner table when he joined them for family holidays. How many times did I let myself believe them? Her stomach roiled. Her phone buzzed in her hand. For one terrible second, she thought it was Douglas, but it was Patricia. I'm emailing you everything, Patricia said briskly. You were right. There were multiple transfers, 3 properties in total, all signed over to Arrowhead Partners. Margaret pressed her palm over her mouth to keep from crying out. Can you send me the records? She managed. I already have, Patricia said. Maggie, whatever this is, I'm sorry. Thank you, she whispered. She hung up and opened her email. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the attachments, deed after deed, each one bearing Douglas's unmistakable signature. Each date matching a time he'd claimed he was protecting their future. A wave of something dark and clean and unstoppable washed over her. She would not let this stand. When she rose and smoothed her skirt, she felt taller, straighter. For the first time in years, she was done being the woman who made excuses. She pulled open the door. Rachel was standing in the hallway, tears brimming in her eyes. Mom, she said softly, what are you going to do? Margaret met her gaze without flinching. I'm going to make them tell the truth, she said, and then I'm going to take everything they thought they could steal. Rachel wiped her cheek. Do you want me with you? Margaret's throat tightened, but she shook her head. Not yet. She walked back down the hall toward the conference room, her heels clicking across the polished floor like the countdown to a reckoning she no longer feared. When Margaret re-entered the conference room, the air was thick with the tension of unfinished arguments. Douglas was leaning over Elliot's shoulder, his voice a low hiss as he gestured to the documents spread across the table. They both stopped speaking when she stepped inside. Rachel and Caleb were still seated, their expressions taut with disbelief and fury. No one moved or spoke. Margaret closed the door with deliberate calm and walked to her seat. She placed her phone face down in front of her and folded her hands. Shall we continue? She said, her voice smooth as glass. Douglas looked up, his face lined with the weariness of a man whose lies were unraveling faster than he could patch them. Maggie, may I say, he began, I know how this looks. Do you? She interrupted, her tone so gentle it made him flinch. Because I don't think you understand at all. Douglas swallowed. It was never meant to hurt you. Margaret leaned forward, locking her gaze to his. But you did hurt me. Repeatedly. With every signature you made behind my back. With every hour you spent lying to my face. Elliot shifted in his chair. Mrs. Lane, perhaps it would be best if we all took more time to... No, she said, turning her attention to him with a look so cold he stopped mid-sentence. You will not interrupt me. You will not spin any more stories. You will sit there, Mr. Price, and you will listen. Elliot's mouth opened, then closed again. Margaret pulled a folder from her handbag. She laid it flat on the table and flipped it open to reveal the printed emails she had saved, the ones she'd found by accident 6 months ago when Douglas had left his tablet unlocked on the kitchen counter. She hadn't looked at them in weeks, telling herself she must have misunderstood the affectionate sign-offs, the references to our time together, the mentions of trips and plans and feelings that had nothing to do with professional transactions. But she no longer believed in coincidences. Margaret's hand didn't shake as she slid the first page across the table to Douglas. "Read it aloud," she said quietly. Douglas's face blanched. "Maggie, read it." Caleb's voice was low and incredulous. "Dad, what is that?" Douglas's throat bobbed. He looked down, scanning the lines, and for a moment Margaret wondered if he would faint. He swallowed again and began, voice hoarse. "I can't stop thinking about last weekend. The hours we had, the way you looked when you finally admitted you wanted this as much as I do." Margaret closed her eyes. Even knowing what was written, hearing it aloud scraped something raw inside her chest. Caleb's chair screeched across the floor as he pushed away from the table, his face red with rage. "Jesus Christ, Dad!" Rachel pressed a shaking hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Margaret opened her eyes and looked directly at Elliot. "Care to deny it now?" Elliot's complexion had gone gray. His jaw worked soundlessly. Douglas tried to stand. "Maggie, let me explain." "Sit down." Her voice cracked like a whip. He sank back into his chair, his hands spread helplessly on the table. "You weren't satisfied just stealing from your own mother, Margaret." Margaret continued, her voice low but clear. "You had to betray me in every possible way. You used the trust of this family to line your pockets and your bed." Elliot found his voice at last. "Margaret, please, this isn't what you think." "Then enlighten me," she snapped, "because from where I'm sitting, it looks exactly like fraud and adultery." The conference room felt too small to hold the magnitude of what she was exposing. Rachel stood abruptly, pointing at Elliot. "You were supposed to protect our family. You were supposed to be her friend." He turned to her, his voice ragged. "Rachel, I never meant—" "No," Margaret interrupted, rising slowly to her feet. "Don't you dare try to claim it was an accident. You knew what you were doing every moment you touched him, every time you helped him hide the money, every time you sat across the dinner table from me and smiled." Elliot looked down at the tabletop, unable to meet her gaze. Caleb's fists were clenched at his sides. "I'm calling Miriam Grant. Right now." Douglas started to protest, but Margaret lifted a hand. "No, Caleb, let me." She picked up her phone and dialed Miriam's number with the same calm she might have used to call for a taxi. When Miriam answered, Margaret's voice was clear, steady, and devastating. "Miriam, it's Margaret Lane. I need you to file suit against Douglas Lane and Elliot Price for fraudulent conveyance, misappropriation of estate assets, and breach of fiduciary duty." Miriam didn't even hesitate. "Consider it done?" Margaret ended the call. She felt as though she had shed 20 years of invisible chains. She turned to Douglas and Elliot, her expression almost pitying. "I spent most of my life believing you were good men," she said softly. "I won't make that mistake again." And with that, she walked out of the conference room. The door closed behind her with a final hushed click that seemed to echo in Margaret's bones. She stood in the quiet hallway for a moment, her hands still wrapped around the cold brass handle. Inside, she could hear the muffled sounds of voices rising, Douglas pleading, Elliot trying to reason, Rachel's strangled sobs. Margaret let go of the handle. For a long moment, she simply breathed. It was done. She turned to find Caleb standing just behind her, his eyes wide with something between rage and shame. "Mom," he whispered, voice rough. "I didn't know, I swear to you." She looked at her son, at the lines of hurt and disbelief carved across his face, and felt something inside her crack, then settle. "I know," she said quietly. "This isn't your burden to carry." He looked as though he might collapse. She reached for his hand and squeezed it once, briefly, before letting go. "I need a moment alone," she told him. "Please, stay with your sister." Caleb nodded, his expression hollow. He stepped back into the conference room, closing the door gently behind him. Margaret walked slowly down the hall to a small alcove with a padded bench in a window that looked out over the city. She sank onto the bench, staring through her reflection in the glass as traffic crawled past, oblivious to the disaster unfolding 10 stories above. "How did I get here?" she thought. "How did I let it get this far?" She remembered every excuse she'd swallowed, every intuition she'd smothered under the need to keep the peace. He's just tired. He's under pressure. He loves me. The lies had been so easy to believe because she'd wanted them to be true, because the alternative meant her entire marriage was built on a foundation as thin and brittle as old ice. The realization didn't make her feel strong. It made her feel hollow. Her phone buzzed in her lap. She glanced down and saw Douglas's name flashing on the screen. She silenced the call without answering. It buzzed again. This time she turned the phone off altogether. Margaret pressed her palm against the window, feeling the cool glass against her skin. In the reflection, she barely recognized the woman staring back. A woman with tear tracks dried on her cheeks, eyes ringed in exhaustion, hair slipping from its careful twist. But beneath the ruin, there was something else, a glint of steel she hadn't seen in herself for years. Edith tried to warn me, she thought. She wanted me to be ready. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the ache of it in her ribs. The door to the conference room creaked open behind her. She didn't look around. Margaret! Douglas's voice. She closed her eyes. Please, he said, I know you hate me. I know I've ruined everything. But let me explain. She turned her head slowly, studying him over her shoulder. Douglas stood in the doorway, shoulders slumped, eyes red. He looked smaller than she had ever seen him. There's nothing left to explain, she said quietly. His voice broke. I love you. The words struck her like a blow, not because they were true, but because of how easily he could still say them after everything he'd done. She rose to her feet. You don't even understand what love is. I made mistakes. No, she interrupted. Mistakes are accidents. You did this on purpose. You chose it, again and again. He looked at her helplessly. Maggie, what happens now? Margaret straightened her shoulders, feeling the last remnants of her illusions fall away. What happens now, she said steadily, is that I finish what your mother started. Douglas flinched as though she'd struck him. She took one last look at him. This man she'd built her life around. This man she'd trusted with everything, and felt nothing but a cold, profound absence. Then she turned and walked past him, her heels echoing across the marble floor. In that moment, she understood something she hadn't let herself acknowledge before. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Margaret didn't look back as she left the law firm. The receptionists had paused in their work, watching her pass with weighing, uneasy eyes. She kept her gaze forward, her stride steady. Outside, the afternoon light was sharp and cold against her skin. She stood on the curb for a moment, breathing in the air as if she had just come up from underwater. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, a town car Miriam had sent. She had anticipated this moment, as though she'd known Margaret would need help reclaiming her dignity as well as her inheritance. The driver stepped out and opened the door. Mrs. Lane? Margaret nodded, sinking into the leather seat without a word. The ride home passed in silence. The city blurred past her window, families crossing streets hand in hand, office workers bustling in and out of glass buildings, all of them unaware that her world had split open. When she stepped into her house, though she suddenly wondered what Douglas might have hidden here too, she was struck by the awful quiet. She went straight to the den. In the bottom drawer of the old mahogany filing cabinet, she pulled out a slim folder labeled Estate Documents. It was where she kept her own records, the ones she'd never thought she'd need. She laid everything out on the table, the deeds, the emails, the copies Patricia had sent her. Each paper was a confession in black ink. For hours she worked. She sorted, highlighted, cross-referenced. She called Miriam and recited every detail. Miriam listened in calm silence, occasionally asking a precise question that made Margaret's stomach turn. At one point, her hand started to tremble. She pressed her palm to the table, willing herself to stay steady. You're doing exactly what Edith hoped you would, Miriam said gently. You are protecting yourself. Margaret swallowed, her throat raw. I just keep thinking, 40 years, how much of it was real? Miriam didn't answer. Some questions had no answer that didn't hurt. Late that night, as Margaret stood in her kitchen drinking cold water, her phone buzzed again. This time it was Rachel. She answered on the first ring. Mom? Rachel's voice was hoarse. Are you okay? Margaret closed her eyes. I don't know. I'm so sorry, Rachel whispered. I had no idea. Neither did Caleb. I know. Can I come over? Margaret hesitated. She had spent the entire day alone, and some part of her needed that. But another part, the part that was still a mother, needed to see her daughter's face. Yes, she whispered. Please. 20 minutes later, Rachel let herself in. She looked as exhausted as Margaret felt. Without a word, she walked into her mother's arms and held her tight. They stayed like that a long time. When Rachel finally pulled back, she said, He asked me to call you. He said he doesn't know what to do. Margaret turned away, her eyes dry and burning. He can do whatever he wants, but he doesn't get to pretend this never happened. Rachel nodded. What happens now? Margaret took a breath. Miriam is filing civil action. There will be criminal referrals for the fraud. Are you sure? I'm sure. The conviction in her own voice surprised her. She wasn't the woman who had tiptoed around Douglas's temper or accepted Elliot's polished reassurances. She wasn't the woman who waited for permission to defend herself. She was done apologizing for other people's choices. That night after Rachel went home, Margaret stood by the window, watching the darkness press against the glass. Her phone buzzed again. This time she didn't bother to look. She powered it off and set it aside. In the silence, she whispered to the empty house, I'm still here. She hadn't meant to say it out loud, but the words brought a small, steady comfort. She was still here, and she would not be defeated. 3 months later, the house was different. It wasn't just the subtle changes Margaret had made. New curtains, new paint, the old rug she'd hated finally rolled up and given away. It was the feeling that the walls had been stripped of pretense, that at last every hidden thing had been dragged into the light. Margaret stood in her kitchen one bright morning, a cup of tea warming her palms. Sunlight spilled across the counter where she'd spread out the final paperwork. The settlement had been finalized yesterday. Arrowhead Partners LLC had been dissolved. The stolen properties were being sold, the proceeds placed into the trust Edith had intended for her. There would still be a criminal process, but Margaret had discovered something liberating in no longer being afraid of consequences. Whatever happened to Douglas and Elliot was no longer her burden to carry. Her phone rang, a number she recognized instantly. For a moment, she considered letting it go to voicemail, but she answered. Margaret, Douglas said, his voice was raw. I just heard from the lawyers. She closed her eyes. I know. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know I never stopped loving you. It might once have twisted a knife in her chest. Now it sounded like an echo from a different life. You don't know how to love, she said gently. You only know how to take. He started to speak, but she ended the call. In the quiet that followed, Margaret felt something settle inside her, an understanding she hadn't dared let herself believe. She was free. When the doorbell rang, she didn't feel that old spike of dread. Instead, she smiled faintly, recognizing Rachel's silhouette through the frosted glass. She opened the door, and her daughter stepped inside with a warm gust of spring air. You look good, Rachel said, studying her face. I feel clean, Margaret admitted, like I finally scraped the last of the lies off my skin. Rachel pressed her lips together. Dad called me. He said you were cold. Margaret raised her eyebrows. And I told him you owed him nothing. For the first time in weeks, Margaret laughed. It felt like a small release of tension she hadn't realized she was still holding. They moved to the kitchen. Margaret poured 2 cups of tea, then reached for the envelope she'd been saving for this moment. What's that? Rachel asked. Your grandmother's letter, Margaret said softly. Rachel looked startled. She left you a letter? She left one for all of us, but this one, Margaret traced a fingertip over Edith's neat handwriting, was meant to be opened after everything was settled. Do you want me to go? No. Margaret shook her head. Stay. She unfolded the paper. Edith's voice came back to her as if she were standing in the room. My dear Margaret, if you are reading this, then you have survived the storm. I want you to know that I saw you. I saw your kindness, your patience, your faith, but I also saw your fear, the fear that if you ever demanded your due, you would lose everything. Let this be your reminder. You never needed to fear the truth. It was the lies that were unworthy of you. Margaret felt her throat tighten. She read the last lines aloud. May you find the peace you deserve in the strength to begin again. With all my love, Edith. She folded the letter and pressed it to her chest. For a long moment, she let herself simply feel it. The grief, the gratitude, the quiet triumph of survival. When she lifted her head, Rachel was crying silently. I'm proud of you, Rachel whispered. Margaret reached across the table, taking her daughter's hand. I'm proud of me too. Later, when Rachel left, Margaret walked out to the garden. Spring had begun to touch everything. The tulips opening their red and yellow faces to the sun, the first tiny buds on the old cherry tree. She stood there a long time, feeling the breeze on her skin, breathing the clean, hopeful air. There were scars that would never fully fade, but for the first time in decades, she felt certain of one thing. She was her own person again. And no one, no matter how cunning, no matter how trusted, would ever steal that from her. As she turned back toward the house, Margaret felt something close to joy. A new beginning, she thought, and this time it would be hers alone.